the CSOs, you are our resistance fighters here because you are inside the belly of the beast. There's a lot of pressure to downplay what you do and make it easier. And yet we need them more than ever.
Hello and welcome again to the CSO Impact Podcast, where we talk to leaders in sustainability and see and discuss how work can play a role in making a positive impression on the planet, on people, and of all of us. Today, I'm really delighted to welcome Gail Whiteman. She is the Professor of Sustainability at the University of Exeter Business School, and also an executive director and founder of the Arctic Basecamp, which is super exciting, held every year in Davos during World Economic Forum since 2016. That's also where we met for the very first time. I'm your host, Harald Neidhardt, the CEO and curator of Future O. But without further ado, welcome, Gail. How are you today?
I'm great. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Well, I think it's super interesting, first of all, not only what you do, but in these times, we need to bring in science and the voice of science from all different aspects. But what you do with the Arctic and putting a finger on the pulse, literally, of this moving thing, animal structure, whatever we say it, I think it's so vital and such a frail environment that we want to know more. So without further ado, for the people who don't really know about Arctic Basecamp, why don't you share a little bit how this idea came about and what is this mission?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. How this idea came about really was out of, I think, necessity and frustration. So I'm a social scientist. So my expertise is in taking the natural science and bringing it into the corporate boardrooms or kind of discussions of global risk. And I had done my PhD quite a while ago in the subarctic, and I knew a lot of the polar scientists well. And in 2010, in the summer, I was invited on a scientific trip through the Northwest Passage of Canada. That's my home country. And I went with some CEOs, some global CEOs, as well as real polar experts. And that's now 15 years ago. But it was very clear at that time that the Arctic was under a state of rapid transformation, and the ice was at a much lower amount than what it had ever been historically. But what was the most captivating part of that was that all of the natural scientists were saying, this will determine the fate of humanity. And that was a shock to me, and also a shock to the CEOs. And the idea was, I was sort of tasked with the idea was, how can we get global leaders to pay attention to Arctic change? Not just because it's bad news for the polar bear, or bad news for local people, which it is, and that's important, but actually because it's bad news for us, and it's ramping up and driving up global risks. So coming out of that in 2011, I said, well, the best way to do that is if we want to talk global risk, we have to go to Davos, because that's where the narrative is shaped, and that's where global leaders convene. So that was the idea, 2011, and it took us some time to get there. It's not that easy to rock up to Davos, as you well know, especially if you're a scientist and you don't have big budgets. So we tried for a few years, but we also didn't just want to come into someone's side event and do a slideshow and then walk back out or take the train back to Zurich. So finally, after a few years of not being able to, and I talked to the forum about this, and they were interested, but they were also just starting on climate realistically in those days. And then I said, you know what, guys, what we're going to do is we're going to bring a real Arctic science tent that you would use in the Arctic, and we're going to camp in it, and we're going to use it as our location for our presentations and our meetings and so on and so on. So actually the first one was 2017, and we were so deeply honored to have Vice President Al Gore, as one of our keynotes, as well as Christiana Figueres, who at that time had really just fairly recently left her role, of course, as the chair of the UNFCCC, so or the executive director. So it came like in a pop, and Harald, that year was minus 24, and certainly we were struggling as scientists. It was very cold. Woke up with icicles for sure in our eyelashes. But the real point was from that time onwards, we were really trying to say how Arctic change, and that's both the loss of the sea ice, especially the summer sea ice. That's glacier melts like Greenland. The Arctic sea ice, that changes extreme weather and ramps up climate change elsewhere. The glacial melt, like on Greenland, that does that too, but also increases sea level rise. And then we have the wild card, which is really abrupt permafrost thaw, which is where methane is released, and that's like a big bomb that could potentially get released, and then that is would eat up most of the remaining carbon budget. So if we wanted to protect the future and make it livable for you and I and our listeners, but billions of people around the world, we really had to pay attention to what the Arctic was doing. So that's what we started to do. And Arctic Basecamp, it started as a pop-up. And then of course it will be our 10th year coming up in 2026. With a mission of really speaking science to power. So the idea that we need to reach powerful people because they actually could make a difference if they pay attention.
I think you're, hitting so much on different levels, but in the root of the problem, I find it interesting that you are not a polar bear, or you're not a scientist for the Arctic, you are a social scientist. So, this is really, isn't this like a system change, right? So and it's really particularly with the Arctic and the melting ice for me, it's like, we see it, but can I change something? It's almost the pinnacle of the whole climate and sustainability discussion. Yes, there's something happening over there. And yes, I understand that it's somehow bad, but if it's 1 millimeter per year right, people don't, it's very hard to grasp. If it's 1.5 degree more in general, you think, a little warmer. But the whole communication, how do you package it? And how do you get politicians who notoriously don't understand it? Corporate leaders think about the next 3 months or next quarter. So you're jumping into the middle of this, and this thing has tentacles in all directions. So which one, or how do you grasp it? And what's your experience over your journey? Has the language changed? How do you, put these people together? I think this year was fantastic. You had also our friend Ingmar, We Don't Have Time, broadcasting. So it becomes a super cool location. Looking at it, it's so impressive that you and the team, really stay there. And I think it's so important that in your eyes on the shutter, basically on top of the mountain. So walk us a little bit through how these discussions unfold and how do you see the system change?
Yeah.
Tactical.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Certainly I would say that the narrative has changed from when we first started to where we are now, and actually maybe been pushed back because of changes in the U.S. administration with all the climate and nature backsliding. But parking that for a minute, when we first started to go to Davos, the conversation around the Arctic was about who owns the minerals, the oil and gas, and potential shipping routes, and maybe geopolitical conflict, although that was lower on the side. All of those have come back up. Of course, we've seen how the Trump administration has been asking for all of those things. So, and Russia as well. So not only the Americans, and Greenland, of course, being a hotspot on those discussions. But in the in-between time, what we have seen is that the way we started to frame it was we did economic modeling. So we started to say globally, if the Arctic, which rapid change is not sufficiently, not to be too geeky here, but rapid Arctic change, whether that's the sea ice, glacier melt, or abrupt permafrost thaw, is not sufficiently in the IPCC models. So the models, which most businesses or governments use to assess climate risk and the costs of it, are underestimating that risk because they're ignoring what is happening in the Arctic realistically. So we started with an economic team to actually say, well, what if some of those things started to happen? And we did economic modeling where we could start to say on a regional basis, who wins and who loses, who's picking up the price tag of that. Also looking at some things like increased Arctic shipping that might have economic gains, which of course it does, but there's also economic cost of increased climate change. So we really came at it from an economic perspective initially, as well as then looking more at the corporate board level on material risk. So if you're the board or CEO, C-suite of an agricultural company, food company, the Arctic is driving material risk in your supply chain and in your customers' supply chain. So trying to take a look at how the Arctic is ramping up extreme weather. And then, as of course, extreme weather is kind of chipped all around the world, we start to then have the conversation more about citizens and also, again, I guess, real estate. So looking at the LA fires or any of the California fires, I mean, that's the Arctic. Or when a few years ago, when there was the smog or the fires that were coming down Canada and they were in Manhattan, I mean, that is the Arctic. So that's coming through, but also the extreme weather that we're seeing in Europe. Changes in a lot of the mid-latitude extreme weather, and that is changing how we live. And there's definitely cost to that, but there's also societal impacts from that. So we try to use all of those things. And certainly from the World Economic Forum, we have shifted I believe we've shifted the narrative significantly, because we don't just show up at Davos. We've also I've been on a number of their future councils and been advising on some of their reports to make sure that science is packed in. So recently, before this Davos, Accenture launched a report called Building Bridges and Risk. And that was specifically looking at a lot of the polar change. And I was the primary academic advisor on that. So we're really starting to see how different industry sectors will be hit. And I think that has been successful. That being said, we've got geopolitical change that has it put a lot of that progress, or at least narrative progress, under threat again, of course.
And I think it's so fascinating. And let's take one more step into, again, the system, because as little as I know is that, well, the melting, let's just talk a little bit about how the Arctic goes to the extreme weather events, right? How is that connected? I learned that we have the, is it AVO, or so the Atlantic currency, which kind of stops or is potentially stopping. Yep. Then you have, let's say, the influence of the sweet water, which is in the ice going into the salt water because of the, let's say, the whales, the krill, and is no longer there. Can you give us a couple of examples which are happening, and then how do we build the arc to extreme weather winds, let's say like the fires in LA, because just to build that bridge.
Yeah. So how it works is that the Arctic ice is really one of the world's biggest insurance policies against runaway climate change, and has been relatively stable except for the last 20 years or so, maybe slightly before that. But really, it's been pretty stable, and now, of course, is significantly in decline. And as there's less of the white, it changes, it absorbs more sunlight that comes into the ocean. It changes the temperature and the circulation of those big ocean currents, and also changes the air circulation because you get a different gradation here. So when you start to have changes to the jet stream because of loss of the sea ice, that changes extreme weather elsewhere, as well as the fact that you warm up the whole system through the ocean, and then you start to get extreme weather changes. And that's how it works. Similarly, with the AMOC, which is one of the big ocean currents, which until really recently, everybody felt from a natural science perspective, it was fairly stable. And new studies are really showing that is under severe threat. And of course, that would be a disaster for many global economies, including much of Europe. When you lose the heat of the Gulf Stream, that changes. That's a big ball game that's changed. On top of that, you change the biodiversity. So as you get Greenland melting, but also runoff from other places on land ice, you do get more sweet water in. So you change the chemical composition, of course, over time, and that affects all the species. So if you do affect krill, well, those are the small. It could be the zooplankton to begin with, and then it's the krill, and then it's all the way up, including of course, big iconic species like whales and beyond. So you get a lot of changes. And we're also seeing on the land in the Arctic that there's less snow, that is releasing permafrost, methane, like those Siberian craters where they seem to burst. That of course adds in another kind of greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, a very potent fast acting but potent gas. But it also means that there's more greening of the Arctic. So the Arctic is less permanently white on land in the most northern parts and is getting more green. So there's more shrubs, which could be good, except that what happens is they absorb more heat, they get really dry, and then also they burn. So that's burn, baby, burn. That's when they start to burn. And then you start to get these massive wildfires, whether that's through the Canadian North or certainly extensively in Siberia, which then adds in air pollution that's got a bit of black into it that goes on the white snow or the white ice. And then you've got this sort of vicious circle that happens from this way. And last but not least, you don't knock a little bit of sea level rise. Superstorm Sandy was devastating, over a decade ago now. It was it was a Category 1 storm. It was a very long storm, and it hit a part of the U.S. that was very unusual to hit. And scientists believe that was because of the loss of the Arctic sea ice at that time even. And on top of that, because there had already been sea level rise, the flood defenses were very quickly overshot. So it's not a millimeter. It's when you start to get these storm surge coming in that can really make all the difference.
So with everything you describe, I think what one topic is actually storytelling and narrative. And what I think you're brilliant to do is really putting the tents in front of everybody in Davos. Then there's these, let's say, artists who put a dead whale or a sort of dead whale into in front of conferences or on some beaches, and they run around as scientists and think this, so people are at least appalled or surprised or something like that. And storytelling is also, in a way, I think, an example you do well because you have a connection with Hollywood, and maybe that brings us into your other initiative, the Nature and Climate Impact Team. Tell us a little bit about how you feel that the storytelling part and maybe being surprising and bringing, let's say, actors or storyteller professionals into this whole picture. That is what I think you have a really good example on that.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for that. We certainly have done a lot of things. We also brought an iceberg from Greenland to COP26, and we had it outside and it was melting. And, all the delegates could see it every day. And they were like, can't you put like a tarp on it so it doesn't melt? And I'm like, I don't think that's the issue. I think you guys should negotiate so we don't melt it here. But yeah, I think the visual material examples are always eye-catching in a way that makes it a bit more real or at least memorable. And bridging curiosity goes a long way. But the real secret here, Harald, which I'm going to tell you, is that before I became a social scientist, so before I went back to grad school, I actually worked in marketing and advertising.
All right.
So I was part of the problem. And that's why I left that industry. Amazing people, and some of my best friends still are from those days. But I was concerned about the unintended impacts of what we were doing. And I wanted to have more meaningful impact. And I quickly realized once I'd started my grad school and we're reading these scientific papers that scientists didn't know how to talk to an audience that wasn't a very specific audience. And I thought, okay, well, I can still do that with my papers, which I have published and done that as well. But then I realized that, especially when I started to work into the natural sciences, I could see that, well, you need to figure out who your target audience is. And you can't not do that. You need to figure it out because which behavior do you want to influence? So that kind of classic approach. And that's why I said, then we'll just do it. I'll just do it. I'll just create Arctic Basecamp. We'll speak science to power. That's the target audience for this initiative. And then let's figure out ways of doing it. And we experimented. And during that period, I met a U.S. actor, Rainn Wilson, through a mutual friend. And he is from U.S. office. I'm sure some of the people that listen will know who he is. And he's hugely interested in climate science and climate action and what can he do. And I took Rainn to Greenland to show him firsthand what was happening with a natural science, a good friend of mine, David Hick, who's a Canadian polar scientist, and Rainn joined our advisory board. And then what we realized, though, was by working with someone like him, as well as someone I'd gone to university with, Chuck Tatham, who is a comedy writer, for shows like Modern Family or Arrested Development, How I Met Your Mother, that they could use their magic and reach people in a way that scientists never could. So we then thought of this idea of, well, what if we were going to speak science to culture? And we created a sister to Arctic Basecamp called Climate Basecamp. So Rain and I co-founded that with Chuck. And the mission then is to try and figure out how we do that storytelling in a cultural milieu, looking at food, fashion, entertainment, sports, and music. And to support that, I then went where I'm on faculty at University of Exeter. I received a very large philanthropic donation to set up a nature and climate impact team from Andre and Rosalie Hoffman, who had seen my work from Davos. And I'm now the Hoffman Impact Professor for accelerating action on nature and climate. So that team takes research fellows, communication fellows, so real experts, not university communications people, real people that have been worked in film or BBC or advertising, etc. And we put them all together, and then we use some of the vehicles like Arctic Basecamp, or certainly helping support the work that Climate Basecamp is doing with the celebrity and entertainment tent, to see how do we make sure that all of those messages really have the right science. And then using the nature and climate impact team to say, which industry sectors do we need to zero in on? So speaking science to power, that's broad brush at Davos. It's really a big global leaders, WEF itself, et cetera, et cetera. But then what we're focusing on with the nature and climate impact team at Exeter is food, consumer packaged goods and electronics, so phones, but also everything else you buy, and then digital technologies. And we're trying to see how do we take the science that we know, figure out why things are stuck, and then try to unstick them. So it's been a real journey. I do think you're right that this idea of storytelling is a red thread that runs through all of those. And I think it comes through not just my marketing advertising experience. I mean, I was always that girl that was interested in stories and writing stories and trying to figure out how to share stories. So the thread runs through it. Yeah.
Fascinating. And I really can relate to it a little bit from advertising. I've spent some years there, but there's something that you take the meaningful things and understand the, psyche, and how do you influence people to buy, soda drink and so on. So using similar tricks in, let's say, making the positive change, it's obviously very desirable. Now, I think such an impressive career, and we talked about, let's say, reaching politicians, world leaders, scientists, and so on. Now, in this podcast, we talk about chief sustainability officers. So how do you relate to this particular type of C-level people in bigger corporates, or are they somehow involved, interested in your work, or what is sort of maybe your view on that role within a corporate environment?
Well, I've worked a lot with the CSO cohorts around the world. I'm also professor in residence at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So that work was kicking off when Peter Bacher came in as a CEO. He brought me in as an advisor, and I brought in the Planetary Boundaries Framework. So sort of really kicking off science-based targets for business. And that was really driven hard and fast by the CSO liaison delegates, WBCSD describes them as. So I know a lot of those folks across the last decade and a half. And I think, one of the things at Davos is that inside the Congress Center, of course, you've got the real CEOs. There's they have one or two badges, whatever. But then alongside it, there's all the side events, and there's a lot of CSOs there as well. So we've certainly had them in Arctic Basecamp. We've had them as speakers with us. We've had them come to our events. We have collaborated with them at the SDG tent. And I think they're really interested in trying to see how we can help them speak to their boards in a way that is evocative. So particularly things with when we start talking material risks for food, the food sector of change, then which flavors are at risk, which foods are at risk of this kind of change. And then of course they're like that information is very useful. for what they do. So I think the CSOs have been, a huge anchor, and boy, in this last 4 months, are they under pressure? Are they under pressure? Wow.
And we will see, let's say, in New York and maybe in Berlin, how many people are traveling or not. We still think this is happening. It's more important than ever. But let's say if you're looking back over the last 5 years or in your journey of, Arctic Basecamp towards the next 5 years, do you have an idea how sustainability or the science aspect incorporates, whether in the role of a CSO, but how is, our interest is how do you see the role of the CSO evolve over the next 5 years?
So I think there's a couple of real major drivers that are going to happen and are happening right now. I think the first one is that there's been such a huge push to take out the words climate and nature if you've got either a significant business in the US or you are headquartered in the US. So the idea of being a chief sustainability officer as a name, as a brand, is under threat. And that could be a problem if a company isn't really starting on the journey, but it doesn't really have to, because I also think it could be the chief risk officer is the chief sustainability officer, because essentially for me, sustainability, Arctic change, and nature degradation is about risk, right? For people, for the planet, and for the economy, and for specific companies. So I think there's going to be turbulence in terms of the names, as well as the function. And the key thing is that the opportunity here is for the CSOs to really see themselves as resistance fighters. It's not the school kids just on the streets. They are essentially such an important. I speak here as a social scientist from academia. That the CSOs, you are our resistance fighters here, because you are inside the belly of the beast. There's a lot of pressure to downplay what you do and make it easier, and yet we need them more than ever. So I hope that the role of the CSO is one that is heroic in the next 5 years.
You also have, thank you for that. You also have connections with youth, because in your university you see young people and you study and teach them. What would you say to young people that want to either go into become a scientist and work in sustainability? What would you maybe give away as tips on the journey towards this role? Is it still important? How should they approach it? Give us a little bit of something that you share with your students, maybe.
Yeah, I think the first thing I always tell them, and we've had a lot of youth delegates that we've brought to Davos. Greta, of course, camped with us when she first came. So we're a strong supporter of the youth voice. But the youth right now are depressed and feel hopeless. And that's both geopolitically because of things like the conflicts in the world, the wars, but also because of climate change. And I think the first thing I say to them is about why they should have hope. And I spend a lot of time working on that and letting them have that emotional fear and grief, and then building from that on what we can do. And I think they need to understand business language, the economics. That's always going to be a driver. But I think they need to be storytellers. And I think what they need to really realize is that they need to hold us accountable. So I think that we need to help them become robust. They feel they're very afraid and discordant about that. But I think it's also about we need that youth, and we need them to be bold. And do they ever want to? And the final thing that they have that I do not have is they have digital technology skills on a level that I, will never get to. And actually, that's where they can be quite disruptive in the roles that may in the past might have been a little bit more easy to understand. I think they should take that space. So I think they should be innovators with their digital skills as well.
Thank you so much. I have a last question and more like an outlook, because now your 10-year anniversary is coming up on the Magic Mountain.
Magic.
So we have scientists always need support in many ways, and obviously we want to, like Ingmar said, make science great again. So what's your outlook on, let's say, Davos 26 for what you do, and how can maybe some of the listeners support you?
Oh, okay. Well, that's a great question. It's a little daunting when we look at the science is under attack. Right. We see it in the U.S., but it's not just in the U.S. It's really under attack, and it's under attack by, of course, the administration in the U.S., but it's also under attack by digital technology. Climate misinformation is one of our biggest threats. And it is rampant. So what we've also seen, though, from a scientific perspective, is that the funding sources are pulling back and pausing. So, we need the science, and we need them at places at Davos, and Arctic Basecamp is the science physical hub. And, one of our most basic requests, which we've never really had to do before, is say, we need funding. We need to make sure that we can actually take the Arctic. We keep the Arctic Basecamp tent there, but it's expensive to get up, and we got to bring people, and the bags are expensive, and so on. So the whole. I mean, I can say that we will definitely be there by hook or by crook by 2026, but science is under siege. And I think the campaign that we had this year of "With Science We Win," with Johan Rockstrom and Jayita Gupta and Future Earth and the Earth Commission and beyond. It's really about not just having us there in 2026, having us there to 2030 and beyond. So it's really about that. How do we make sure that science is there in a physical way, in a visible way, at Davos every year? And I think the first key thing is absolutely any kind of funding to help lift that would be hugely appreciated.
Thank you so much. Here's our little thing to support you in giving some audience. And I really appreciate your time. So fascinating and so important what you do. Thank you so much, Gail.
Oh, thank you so much.